Thank you. 谢谢. 你好. 我叫 Jamie Dow. 我是 Leeds 大学的哲学老师。很高兴认识你。我不说中文 so now 英文。Okay, I'm going to talk about the use of emotions in persuasion and how that relates to both Aristotle's studies and some texts in Aristotle, but also to contemporary life, but also contemporary theory. So I want to situate Aristotle's work and my interpretation of Aristotle within a scholarly context, but also within a contemporary context of how it might be applied. So I'm going to, and also in Aristotle's context. So I'm going to do a bit of kind of positioning at the beginning. So I'll say a little, so here's the plan. I'm going to give a bit of background, situate Aristotle's work within those different contexts, and then I'm going to give a sketch of how, according to me, emotion works within persuasion, within skilled rhetoric in Aristotle. And I'm going to try and connect that with the practical value of Aristotle's view, both in his own day and for us today. And that's going to generate some scholarly puzzles about the emotions. So this is the book that Cheng Wei mentioned. And in this book, I was trying to situate Aristotle's understanding of the emotions within his theory of rhetoric. That his work on rhetoric is where we find his most extensive discussion of the passions. And it's important that our interpretation makes sense of their place within that work. I have not convinced the scholarly world of everything within that book, so I'm currently working on a more extensive defense of Aristotle's view of rhetoric. So I'm mostly working at the moment in finishing a book on rhetoric, which is not primarily about the emotions, but there are some new scholarly puzzles about the passions that I need to deal with, and so this is an opportunity for me to see what you think of those. So this is the new book. It's a more thoroughgoing defense of Aristotle's view of rhetoric, and there are a couple of issues that I'm going to mention which are significant in the chapter on emotion. Last year, another ancient philosophy colleague of mine at the University of Bristol in the UK, Giles Pearson, published this book, which is also on Aristotle on the emotions. And I'm at the beginning of working out how I respond to this book. So I'm going to raise what I think are some problems for his view. In other words, some reasons why I think I'm right and he isn't. And central to this, in a way, is going back in Aristotle's studies. In the 1970s, scholars started getting interested in Aristotle's work on rhetoric, and the most important work of that era on Aristotle on the emotions is this book by William Fortenbaugh. And what he pointed out was that Aristotle's treatment of the emotion is connected to so many different areas of his thought. So his psychology, obviously, working out what the passions are, how they're connected to human motivation, how they arise, and so on. To his rhetoric, to his biology. So, for example, the ascription of passions to non-human animals, as well as to humans. To ethics and the good life. So famously, Aristotle thinks that our emotions should be felt in the mean. His doctrine of the mean applies to the passions. To politics, So he thought that emotions were importantly involved in different kinds of revolutions that city-states could undergo, and in literary criticism. So famously, his Poetics makes the emotions of pity and fear central to the experience of good tragedy. Now, I am making the case that in this list, surprisingly, rhetoric is a little bit neglected, and people have developed theories of emotion in Aristotle in which their interest has been mostly on the other items on the list and insufficiently attentive to the place, the context within rhetoric. So here's an initial sketch of Aristotle's view on how orators should deal with the passions. So what is his attitude towards emotion arousal? Does he think that emotion arousal is all bad? No, he doesn't. Does he think that emotion arousal in any form whatsoever is fine? No, he doesn't. He has some kind of middle way. So he thinks that if you use emotion irrelevantly, that's bad. That is not part of the proper exercise of rhetorical expertise. But when emotion arousal constitutes proof, when arousing the audience emotions contributes to proving the orator's point, then he does commend it. Well, what does that mean? I'm going to say a bit more about that. But roughly, our starting point needs to be that Aristotle seems to have some criteria for rejecting some uses of emotion arousal in rhetoric and accepting and commending others. And if we can work out what those criteria are, we might have a possible set of criteria that we could apply to emotion arousal as it's used in our own day. So Aristotle's view might be a good view, not just for ancient Greeks, but maybe for us. We can at least test it and try it. So here's something about Aristotle's context, and then I'm going to say something about our context. Aristotle was writing in a context in Athens in which in the recent past there had been a number of orators who had wielded significant power within the city-state of Athens because of their ability to manipulate and gain support from the democratic population of Athens. So Cleon, Alcibiades, and Lysias are the sort of famous names associated with this ability. So people who were called demagogues, they were able to achieve great power in the city-state because of their ability to speak and gain a following among the population. And as well as practitioners, there were theorists. So here are the two most famous theorists of the time. So Gorgias, and if you have read your Plato, Plato's dialogue called Gorgias is about a real person who really existed, and he was this famous teacher that visited Athens and caused a sensation through his teaching of what he called the skill of oratory. So he, and Thrasymachus as well, was another very famous Athenian teacher of oratory. And for both of these people, the way they sold the attractions of the abilities that they taught people was by comparing them to a number of things. So they compared the skills that they conveyed to an ability in boxing or wrestling. So in English, we have an expression giving somebody a knockdown argument. So that's a wrestling metaphor, and the first person to use it was this guy. He wrote a work called Knockdown Arguments, in which you overthrow your opponent like a wrestling move. And they compared oratorical abilities to magic and spells. And the comparison is that in a magic spell, maybe if you cast a magic spell to make somebody fall in love with you, or to make them fall ill or something, if they're an enemy, the way magic works, well, nobody knows how it works. Somebody does something strange here with some potions, and over there, somebody falls in love with you. And we know not how, right? And the idea is that oratory is a bit like that. The orator speaks and something magical happens. The listeners suddenly are in their grasp. And both Gorgias and Thrasymachus were commending their abilities on the grounds that they were either a bit like being able to bash your opponent like a boxer, or to manipulate them in a magical way like a sorcerer. The philosophers, some of the philosophers didn't like it. So if you've read Plato's Gorgias, or indeed his Phaedrus, I think, it's basically against those previous guys. Both Socrates and Plato seem to have taken a strong stance against the value of this kind of oratory. And against that background, Aristotle is adopting a more moderate position. So he's defending oratory, at least some forms of oratory. In our own day, when it comes to defending emotion in the public sphere, we also have got some people who are wanting, in a sense, like Aristotle, to defend the value of emotion in the public sphere and in public debate. So from left to right, Maisha Cherry, Iris Marion Young, and Martha Nussbaum have all in various ways defended the value and importance of emotion in public life. Both feeling emotions, so the value of actually having emotional responses to important issues, but also of having space for emotions to be expressed in public debate. So here is Iris Marion Young, and she says, a norm of dispassionateness. In other words, if we say, keep emotions out of public debate, if we said that, it dismisses and devalues embodied forms of expression, emotion, and figurative expressions. People's contributions to a discussion tend to be excluded from serious consideration, not because of what is said, but because of how it is said. Norms of orderliness sometimes exclude disruptive or emotional forms of expression that can be very effective in getting people's attention and making important points. Okay, so she is defending the use of emotional, more disruptive, more figurative ways of communicating and persuading. And she makes the point that the privileging of allegedly dispassionate speech styles correlates with other differences of social privilege. The speech culture of white middle-class men tends to be more controlled without significant gesture or expression or emotion. The speech culture of women, racialized or ethnicized minorities, and working class people, on the other hand, often is or is perceived to be more excited and embodied, values more the expression of emotion, uses figurative language, modulates tone of voice, and gestures widely. In other words, if we insist on keeping the passions out of public persuasion, what we are doing is entrenching the power of people who are already privileged. People basically like me, I guess, is the... Now, let's... Yeah, we were never going to get through a talk without him featuring. So, in a way, I don't have anything critical to say about Iris Marion Young or Martha Nussbaum or Maisha Cherry. What I'm pointing out is that their defense of emotion in public life is really about its instrumental usefulness. So they think that emotions have proper targets. They think we should be angry when we encounter injustice, and that might be a very important part of fighting against injustice and opposing it. But they also think that the expression of the passions is instrumentally useful in that struggle as well. Now, the position of Aristotle that I'm defending is not in any way opposed to that, but it's defending the value of emotions on more, as we say among the philosophers, on more epistemic grounds. In other words, Aristotle's position is going to be that by arousing people's emotions, we can help them to understand things better in ways that wouldn't have been so easily achieved without the use of emotion. And if his view can be defended, then it will yield a set of criteria that might help us distinguish the good cases from the bad cases. So I'm going to offer you a set of cases. Maybe some of them are good and some of them are bad. So here is a recent case of the arousal of emotion in political persuasion. Here he is. Okay, so this is quite unusual in some ways in public life because it involves the emotion of disgust. I don't know whether this incident was well known in China when it happened. You heard about this cats and dogs thing over here? This is the most weird thing I think I've ever witnessed in politics. So at one stage in the election campaign, Donald Trump said, "They're eating the dogs, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people who live there." And this is about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. So, is this a good use of arousal of the passions? Undoubtedly, it was so it was politically effective. Here's another example on the opposite end of the spectrum. So this is, he's now dead actually, Alex Salmond, a Scottish politician, favours Scottish independence, the independence of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. And during the referendum campaign for whether Scotland should become an independent country, he dismissed the strategy of the no campaign, so those who wanted the United Kingdom Scotland to stay within the United Kingdom. He dismissed that campaign as Project Fear. So his implication was, this campaign does not have any good arguments, and so they are resorting to emotion as an inferior mode of persuasion. So it's a dismissive slogan. When he's characterizing the no campaign as Project Fear, he's being dismissive about it. It's an emotional campaign because it hasn't got good arguments. That's the implication. Okay, so there are two kind of opposite cases in politics, but the arousal of emotion is not confined to politics. When we think about leadership, so if we think about, so this is my favorite schematic diagram, if we think about leaders in, say, charities or in business or in politics or in public administration, as whoever's leading is exerting a kind of influence on a follower, and the follower is responding to their influence in some kind of way. That's what leading is. Well, that might be undertaken in an emotional way as well. So here are a couple of examples. So a famous management book by John Cotter gives an example from a manufacturing company. He doesn't actually say what they made. Maybe they made, I don't know, mobile phones, say. And he describes the leader of that organization, the chief executive, who said to their staff, "We're going to have a change of strategy in this manufacturing business. We're going to be making fewer Fiats and more Mercedes." Right? He didn't mean that they were going to start making cars. What he meant was they were going to make fewer, cheaper mass market products, and they were going to be making and selling more luxury, high-end products. But he didn't say it in that way. He said it using fiats. You know, nobody's really excited about owning a Fiat car, all right? But people are kind of, you know, people who own Mercedes kind of, you know, there's a kind of kudos associated with it, right? So this was a way of communicating with his staff, and he chose a way that was going to be appealing to them at an emotional level, that would help them feel good about the change that was being proposed for the company. Here's another example. So IBM, the big tech giant, based in the US, but a global firm, they underwent a massive strategic change in the late 80s and early 90s. And the chief executive at the center of it was a guy called Lou Gerstner. And at that time, the prevailing wisdom in business was that if you wanted to be responsive to changing market conditions, to customer needs, to different circumstances, if you wanted to be responsive and able to respond quickly to different market conditions, you needed to be a small company. That was the general wisdom at that time. And even then, IBM was a huge company. So to put it another way, if you're an elephant, you won't be able to dance. And the way he put it to his staff in this slogan was, who says elephants can't dance? Right? This was his way of expressing the company's direction, the strategy that he was proposing. In other words, what he was saying was, I reject the idea that we can't stay big and get all the advantages of being really big, plus also be quick and responsive to different circumstances, customer needs, market conditions. And his other slogan was, if the elephant starts dancing, the ants had better get off the dance floor. Okay, so now these you might think are strange ways for business leaders to communicate their vision and their strategy for a company, but it's maybe obvious in this context that the advantage that they have is that they connect emotionally with, in this case, staff of the company, that if you think that the company could stay an elephant but learn how to dance and so be kind of invincible within its sector, you can see how that kind of would be capable of gripping staff at an emotional level with the attractiveness of that vision for the company. Okay, does that make sense? So emotional arousal in business, in politics, is as alive and well today as it was in antiquity. I'm going to skip the sporting connection. That was just maybe a little excuse to put my football team's badge on the screen in front of people. But if any of you follow British football at the moment, you all know that it's a sad time for Ipswich Town fans. Okay, so Nussbaum, Young and Cherry, instrumentally useful and maybe fitting. Aristotle's arguing that emotions can be a way of giving people proof. I'm going to quickly go through some bits of Aristotle because I think we need to understand what proofs are. So here's something that Aristotle says near the beginning of his work on rhetoric. So he says, previous writers of works with the title Expertise in Public Speaking, so works, for example, by somebody like Thrasymachus. So the title of the work is Expertise in Public Speaking, but Aristotle says they have told us virtually nothing about the expertise in public speaking. That expertise, the expertise in public speaking, is an expertise in providing proofs to people. That's what it is. Nothing else. That's a really strident That's a very important statement in this work of Aristotle's. The expertise in rhetoric is in the provision of proofs, nothing else. All other aspects of speaking are ancillary. They all play a subservient role to providing proofs. And these guys, Thrasymachus, haven't told us anything about providing proofs. So, in other words, they haven't told us much about rhetoric. What they have spent most of their effort telling us is how to speak irrelevantly. Their main preoccupations, slander, pity, anger, and similar set-piece emotion plays of the kind they supply, of which, by the way, we've got examples surviving from Thrasymachus. Those things are irrelevant to the issue under consideration. They're a direct bid for the allegiance of the juror. So in other words, they haven't told us anything about the things that really do belong to rhetoric, and they've told us a whole lot of stuff about irrelevant techniques which can't possibly contribute to rhetoric. And the conclusion is what he started with. They have told us hardly anything about that expertise. That's the conclusion of this passage. So what is a proof? Okay, so there's an odd little bit of Aristotle. I'm going to speed over this. I'm happy to talk about it with the technical folks if you wish to. But Aristotle says a proof is a kind of demonstration. So a demonstration is a valid argument from a special kind of known premises. It's the kind of argument that yields knowledge and understanding in Aristotle. So a proof is like that. The rhetorical version of a demonstration is making a point. That's the sort of ordinary name for it. That's what orators do, making a point. And making a point is where you make an inference. And incidentally, Aristotle adds, who's going to be the best person to teach you about making an inference? The answer of which is, of course, Aristotle. The inventor of syllogistic logic is going to be a pretty good person to tell you about all that stuff. Okay, so I think the headline point in this passage is that proofs, which are the center of the expertise in rhetoric, according to Aristotle, share all of their essential features with valid deductive arguments. In other words, they start from premises that are in the right kind of good standing, and they proceed through a good inference to the conclusion. And the thought is something like, if you're right to accept the premises, then you ought to accept the conclusion. All right, so as every good philosophy student knows, an argument is a set of sentences such that the truth of the premises necessitates, so we might not quite be in necessitation territory here, the truth of the conclusion. Now, I think in rhetoric, the thought here would be more like, if you are right to accept the premises, you are under rational pressure to accept the truth of the conclusion. And indeed, you'd be right to accept the truth of the conclusion if you do. Okay, so famously I'm going to skip over this. Famously, Aristotle thinks that there are three types of proof that the orator should go about developing. So the simplest of these is proofs that are in the argument itself. So when an orator makes a point, they tell you some evidence, or they give you some premises, and they say, look, my conclusion follows from those premises. Right? That would be giving people an argument. So that would be a logos proof. But the other two are in the character of the speaker. So that would be, so actually I'm going to talk about that tomorrow in Rendar. But roughly the thought there is that sometimes people persuade us not by telling us what the reasons are, but by helping us to feel confident or to know that they know what they're talking about. So in other words, I mean, maybe some of that might be through this evening on some of the details here. Maybe I haven't given you really the full detailed argument for why we should interpret Aristotle in these ways, but maybe I've said enough to convince you that I know what I'm talking about. So even though you don't believe the argument, you believe me. That would be an example of proof in the character of the speaker. If the speaker manages to convince you that there's something about them that is such that they know what they're talking about and so on, and that they're telling you what they think, then that can be a kind of proof, says Aristotle. Sometimes there's no time to go through the whole argument and all the evidence. Sometimes we just need to know who to trust. Right? So that would be an example of that. And then the one in the middle is putting the listener into a certain condition. And Aristotle thinks that that also can work to give people good grounds for believing the orator's proposed conclusion. Okay, that says the same thing. Okay, so here we go with, I want to trace out how exactly Aristotle thinks that works with the passions. So how can arousing an audience's emotions give them proof of anything? It's really easy to see how giving somebody an argument can provide proof, right? We can all understand that. Giving somebody an argument, if the argument's good, that can provide somebody with proof. But how can arousing their emotions provide them with proof? So Aristotle says things don't look the same to us when we feel allegiance to somebody. So for those of you with Greek, philia is the word for feeling allegiance to. Things don't look the same to us when we feel allegiance to somebody as when we're hostile, nor when we're angry as when we're calm. They either look totally different or they look different in proportion. So if you're feeling allegiance towards somebody, and they're the defendant in a trial, you'll either think they committed no crime, or you'll think that the crime was fairly minor. But if you're hostile to them, it'll be the opposite. Okay, so that's what Aristotle says. So I'm going to work through his example of feeling allegiance to somebody. So here's what I think feeling allegiance to somebody is according to Aristotle. So some of this is drawn from what he says about philia, about feeling. Well, so philia is sometimes translated love or friendship, but it's got a political meaning in Greek as well. It's sort of feeling on the same side as somebody. And in the Rhetoric, Aristotle says that if you in this sense feel allegiance with somebody, or are their friend in this kind of way, you will think that they approve of the same sorts of things as you, they disapprove of the same sorts of things. In other words, they share your values, they're likely to do the same things in the same sorts of circumstances. And my summary of this is, what you feel is, they're one of the good guys. They're kind of like me. They're on the side of the angels, right? And the thought is, you can think that in a dispassionate way, but you can also feel that about somebody. If you're feeling a sense of allegiance towards, the orator can get you to kind of feel that. Here is somebody whose values are in the right place. Somebody kind of like me. And if you put that together with a pretty plausible second premise, if Cleanthes is one of the good guys, then probably Cleanthes didn't do anything wrong. And it follows from that probably Cleanthes didn't do anything wrong. And what I want to suggest is that's how Aristotle thinks. So remember that allegiance, philia, is Aristotle's own example. And I'm thinking this is how that example, this is what he's got in mind. And this would be a way in which you could use a premise which is felt emotionally to contribute to deriving a conclusion that's important to the orator. So one of the things that I didn't spend much time on in the earlier work, but which I think I need to make more explicit in now, is that what's happening here, in order for this to be a case of proof, we need transmission of justification. So when I talked about arguments earlier, I put it in terms of truth conditions, but another way we can think of arguments is that if you're justified in accepting the premises and the argument is valid, that justification is transmitted onto the conclusion. In other words, valid arguments transmit justification from the premises to the conclusion, or at least there's a bit of a literature on this, but the exceptions are weird exceptions. Let's go with the generalization. So here's a non-emotional example. Alcibiades had the motive to commit the crime. Alcibiades had the means. Alcibiades had the opportunity. Suppose we're justified in thinking all of those things, and perhaps we think that if somebody has the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit a crime, then they did commit the crime, or maybe it's likely that they committed the crime. Our justification for accepting these premises will transmit onto the conclusion. And it's exactly that I think is happening here. Now that's important for the emotion bit, right? Because here's another feature of emotions, is that they can be justified and unjustified. So we can get angry with people, and sometimes our anger is justified, and sometimes it isn't, right? We can get jealous of people, and sometimes our jealousy is justified, and sometimes it isn't. And this applies to all kinds of emotions. We can be afraid in circumstances that are entirely justified, and we can be afraid in ways that are not justified. So the thought here, I think, is that Aristotle's got in mind that the way in which the orator arouses those feelings of affiliation and allegiance to Cleanthes, if they're justified, then that justification can be transmitted onto the conclusion if the argument's valid. That's the thought. Right, let me just take stock as to where I've been riffing my way through here without looking at my notes. Let me just make sure I'm... And we have some evidence that Aristotle thought that this was exactly how you should arouse the passions. So when he's introducing his treatment of the passions early on in Book 2 of the Rhetoric, he says this. He says, just as in the previous section, so the previous section was when he was talking about argument proofs. So the large sections of Book 1 of the Rhetoric, in which he's got a kind of catalogue of different sorts of evidence and plausible premises that you might be able to use in arguments, in argument proofs, logos proofs. And he says, just as when we were giving our catalogue of premises that you might use in argument proofs, we systematically set out the premises that you could use. So here, in our treatment of the passions, that's what we're going to do here in connection with these. Let us do the same and undertake a classification in the same way. It's not absolutely explicit, but what it looks like he's saying is, here are a bunch of premises that you can use to arouse people's emotions. In other words, there's going to be a kind of inferential structure to the way in which the emotions are aroused and the way in which they're used in argument. Okay, so the thought is, when emotion arousal contributes to proof, there are a number of features. The things we feel constitute a step in an argument to the orator's conclusion, right? Like my Cleanthes example. And it'll be proof if our feelings are justified and if the argument has a valid form such that the justification for accepting the premises is transmitted onto the conclusion. Okay, does that make sense? And that is a set of criteria, right? Those are features that could be present in some cases, but not in others. So particularly the issue is going to be, are the feelings justified, and is the justification transmitted via a valid argument onto the conclusion? What about Lou Gerstner and his dancing elephant? Okay, so when he appeals to staff members of IBM with this elephant imagery to convey the attractiveness of his proposed strategy, is the emotion, this sort of perhaps excitement about what IBM could be, is that justified? Well, I take it that it could be. That's the thought. It could be justified, right? So it would be justified if that is possible for IBM. Turned out it was pretty much possible. But of course, he was using this before we knew it was possible. But suppose he could convince people that this is possible. It is possible for the elephant to dance, and he'd given sufficient justification for it's being possible for the elephant to dance. But also, if he's given some justification for thinking that if that could happen, it really would be attractive for the company. So those are the sorts of things that it looks like, if this is to be proof, if this is to be the right kind of emotional persuasion according to Aristotle in Lou Gerstner's mouth, then the emotions that are involved ought to be justified, and it ought to follow from that excitement that the conclusion is something maybe like, so let's go, let's make this our strategy. If the attractiveness of the strategy contributes to justifying the conclusion, which is we should do this, or something like that. Okay, so that would be the case there. What about Donald Trump and the discussed strategy? So it looks as though this is not going to do so well by Aristotle's criteria. I mean, for a start, no evidence is given that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, are eating dogs, cats, or any other pets. They weren't. Persuasive strategies that are based on lies and made up stuff are not going to do well by Aristotle's criteria. And it also looks as though there's going to be another problem here, which is that even if that were true, it's not so obvious that there are going to be a bunch of further steps, because I take it that the conclusion that Donald Trump wants at that moment is something like, elect me as the president. So there's at least going to be a question as to whether that premise, even if it was justified, or how much it contributes to the conclusion that he wants. But I guess with those two examples, my suggestion is you can see how the criteria that Aristotle offers can be applied to any given case. And the sort of thing that I'm most interested in here is, so somebody like Donald Trump, and there are people in various sectors that would be similar. Some people don't care about whether the methods that they use are ethical or they don't care about the merits or the defensibility of the methods that they use. So I think what I've got to say will not be of interest to those people, but some leaders in politics and business and in public administration, and in religious organizations and in charities, there are lots of people who are in positions of influence and leadership and who want to know how to deal with the people that they are tasked with leading and want to know how to do that in an ethical way. So my suggestion is that Aristotle is providing some tools and resources for people who are interested in leading ethically to work out which types of techniques they can use on which occasions and which they should avoid. Right? And that might not be, that might depend on the circumstances. Right? So there might be other occasions on which arousing disgust, maybe, could be appropriate. Certainly, perhaps fear looks like if there really is danger, then, and you've got justification for feeling danger, and that helps you to justify a conclusion about supporting a policy that would avoid that danger. It looks as though we don't get a blanket acceptance of the use of fear, nor a blanket rejection. We get a set of criteria that the leader can apply in different circumstances to judge what kinds of techniques can rightly be used on what occasions. Now, so for a little scholarly, so that's all the practical stuff. I want to say a little bit about this scholarly stuff, and it's been nice to be talking about this this book this afternoon. So, Giles Pearson. When I first found out that Giles Pearson was writing a book defending the view that, according to Aristotle, the emotions are pleasures and pains, I was delighted because I thought, he's writing a book saying Jamie Dow is right. But it turns out he isn't. So his view is that emotions are not, so so let me go on a slide. So this is the Aristotle stuff, and I'm saying it presents a problem for Giles Pearson. I thought there was something else that. Okay. Giles Pearson's view is that the emotions are pleasures and pains, but that as pleasures and pains, they are just reactions to cognitive states of the subject. So it's a bit of sort of emotions theory. Lots of people in contemporary theory of emotion think that emotions are ways of representing the world. So if you're afraid of dogs, you think that dogs pose some threat to you. You see dogs as dangerous in some way. So the emotion itself, according to lots of people, has this cognitive content to it, namely of dogs. So if you're afraid of dogs, when you're afraid, that state is about dogs, and it involves representing them as dangerous. Now, Giles's view, and it involves in some way kind of committing yourself to the idea that they are dangerous. So you're not just kind of, hey, they might be dangerous. It's not just sort of entertaining the thought that dogs might be dangerous. If you're afraid of them, you're kind of committed to the dangerousness of the dogs. You're not neutral about this. Now, according to Giles Pearson, we do have cognitive states of that kind, but those aren't the emotions. The emotions are just painful feelings that are somehow direct reactions to maybe the beliefs or experiences that we have of dogs. And he explicitly says that our feelings cannot be subject to epistemic evaluation. So they cannot be evaluated as justified or unjustified. I think he doesn't think they can be evaluated as true or false. That seems even more weird to me. But let's focus on the justified bit. If the emotions themselves can't be justified or unjustified, then it seems to me that they cannot play the part that I think they need to play in proof in Aristotle. And that, I think, is a problem for Giles's view. because we need not just to make sense of how Aristotle's view of the emotion fits in with his biology and his ethics and his psychology, but we need to make sense of how it fits in with his rhetoric. And how it fits in with his rhetoric is as a way of providing proof. There's a further puzzle here, which is a puzzle for me as well as for Giles Pearson. And I'm going to just say a little bit about that. I'll maybe finish with this puzzle. So in the picture of Aristotle's view that I've described, the orator gives the audience a load of evidence that Cleanthes is one of the good guys, that he has the right values, that he'll react in the same way as us. And on the basis of that, they feel allegiance towards Cleanthes, which is a feeling, they feel that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. So they have a justified emotion corresponding to premise 1 of this argument. And then the argument goes through. Now, if you're the orator and you think, well, I've got all this persuasive work to do. In order to make this process happen, I've got to present all this evidence. I've got to make people emotionally accept that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. And it looks as though I've got to do that in exactly the same way that I would have to proceed if I was wanting them to get them just to believe that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. But it looks like if I'm going to get them really to feel that kind of sense of allegiance with Cleanthes, I've got to do it in the right kind of emotional way. I've got to kind of hit the right emotional buttons, maybe use the right kind of emotional words, so that they don't just believe that Cleanthes is one of the good guys. They really feel it. And that just looks like a harder task than getting the audience simply to accept that premise. So there's a kind of why bother with emotion puzzle on the view that I'm presenting, because it looks like, on my view, emotion proofs involve doing all of the work that reason proofs involve and a bit more. So why would any orator ever bother doing that if the argument will go through on the basis of a less emotional pitch? And I think, so that's a problem for me, and I'll tell you how I answer it. I think it's even more of a problem for Giles, because on Giles's view, he thinks that the audience needs to have some sort of cognitive state accepting that premise, but that cognitive state isn't the emotion. It's a cognitive state that could be justified or unjustified, and then in addition to that, they have this other emotional state directed at that, but which isn't capable of being justified or unjustified, and therefore the emotion actually isn't playing any part in the process. So it looks as though there's a sort of spare wheel worry for, at least on my view, when you run a emotional proof, the emotion is at least doing some work in generating the conclusion. But on Giles's view, the emotion isn't doing any work at all generating the conclusion. So the question of why you'd bother arousing it is I think, more pressing for him than it is for me. I mean, maybe he can help himself to my solution. Here's what I think the best solution is to this puzzle. Okay, so that's the puzzle. I'll skip through this. How do they make a difference? Incidentally, Aristotle thinks you can block if you've got in early. If you're the first speaker, you can block the emotion arousal of the second speaker. And he has some things to say about that. So the way I think all of this works and why the emotions are advantageous to the orator is because they captivate our attention. So Michael Brady, in his work on the emotions, has written about this, and he in turn is actually drawing on earlier work by the psychologist Ledoux on the emotional brain. So when we are emotional about any object, we tend to fixate on it. So if you're ever feeling jealous, you just can't get your mind off possible evidence of infidelity or something. If you're angry with somebody, you just go over the thing they did wrong all the time in your mind. If you're afraid of something, you know, if you're afraid of spiders in the bath and you know there's a spider in the bath, you sort of somehow keep looking in the bath. Like, you'd be much happier if you just went somewhere else in the house, but somehow, you know, your attention is on the bath with the spider in it, right? So Aristotle says something along these lines: an activity is intensified by its proper pleasure, since each class of things is better judged of and brought to precision by those who engage in the activity with pleasure. If you enjoy geometry, you'll be able to concentrate well on geometry. If you hate geometry, you'll be constantly getting distracted from geometry. Okay, ditto with music, building, and anything else. Incidentally, this is a curse. I really like music, but it's really difficult for me to listen to lots of music. In fact, if I'm talking to somebody and like some music starts playing, it's embarrassing and it's kind of rude because I'm distracted from the person I'm talking to by the music. And when I'm working, I can't have music playing because I won't do any work. I'll just listen to the music. Even if the music's quite bad, it's annoying. So yes, I listen to much less music than... so there's stuff about flute playing here. If you really enjoy flute playing... Actually, this is... You know, so Aristotle's writing about me here. If you really like music and somebody starts playing some music and you're trying to work on an argument... The flute playing, the music, destroys the activity, the study, the research that was concerned with the argument. And as he points out, when we enjoy anything very much, we do not throw ourselves into anything else. So when we are enjoying something, we're totally fixated on it. And we do one thing only when we're not much pleased by another. For example, in the theatre, the people who eat sweets do so most when the actors are poor. So, you know, perhaps modern day, if the film's really good, you come to the end of it, right, and there's all your popcorn still full up in the bucket, right? But if you've finished all your popcorn, it says something about the film probably wasn't that great. So there we go. He's as fresh as ever is Aristotle. In other words, emotions, both positive and negative, consume our attention. And this, I think, is what makes them useful to the orator. So I sort of put this by saying they're kind of sticky. They make our cognitions sort of sticky. They help us fixate on the objects, and it's difficult to shift them. So, in other words, if he's got us to really feel that Cleanthes is one of the good guys, that'll be hard to shift. Now, that doesn't solve every problem. In fact, it might even raise another. And incidentally, I think this is an area of ethics that is quite important in today, right? Because the attention economy is so significant in so many areas of life, so many corporations basically competing for our attention. And the issue of what we attend to and what we don't attend to makes a huge difference to what we end up doing, to the beliefs that we form, to the actions that we take, the actions that we don't take. So, and in the end, I think this is an issue which Aristotle could address, but I don't think he actually does address this. So I've kind of given an answer to why would you bother using emotion, which raises a further problem, and I don't think Aristotle addresses this problem. The best I can do on his behalf is I think he could address it. And that's because, as those of you who know Aristotle's ethics may be familiar with, character virtue, so the things that we tend to call virtues, virtue of character, is concerned with emotions and with actions. And in these, you can have too much, you can have too little, and you can have just the right amount. Having just the right amount, well, there are all sorts of bad ways to feel the passions, but having them in the right way involves feeling them when you should, in the circumstances you should, at the people you should, for the purpose you should, and I think this is the crucial phrase for us, in the way you should. And that's what's in the mean and best and belongs to virtue. So in the way you should, so hos dei, covers, I think, the intensity of emotion, which determines how attention-consuming it would be. So the suggestion here would be that what orators should do is ensure that the emotions that they arouse in audiences are emotions that are felt in the way that they should be. In other words, that the orator is arousing emotions that don't go beyond the bounds of what is proportionate in intensity to the object that they're being felt towards. Does that make sense? So Aristotle doesn't give that response to the problem that I just raised, but I think that's the response that he should give on the basis of what he says in the Ethics. Okay, so I'm suggesting that Aristotle rejects irrelevant persuasive use of emotion because it can't, if it's irrelevant, it can't contribute to proof, right? It can't contribute to an argument where the justification of the premises yields the orator's conclusion, because irrelevant means there won't be an inference to that conclusion. He commends emotional arousal when it does constitute proof. Justified emotions render conclusions inferred from them justified. In other words, there's transmission of justification. And that gives us a set of criteria that is useful and applicable, not just in understanding Aristotle, but in our own day. And this matters and is useful because of our complex psychology, in which pleasure and pain consume our attention and play this quite important role in our psychology, which, if we don't use it, somebody else will. So let's have some criteria that enable us to do so in the right kind of way. So I think that's it.
So now the floor is open to discussions. So who'd like to go first?
Thank you for your brilliant speech. I have a question on the justification of emotion. Because I think in your speech you say the transmission of emotional justification is like an argument.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether the justification of emotion must be a cognitive process.